When the first trailer for Snow White arrived, I remember pressing play with a strange mix of curiosity and caution. Disney live-action remakes have trained audiences like me to expect spectacle, familiarity, and a careful balance between old memories and new ideas. What I did not expect was the intensity of the reaction that followed almost immediately after the trailer went public. Within hours, the conversation around the film stopped being about costumes, music, or visual effects, and turned into something far more volatile. I was not just watching a trailer anymore. I was watching the beginning of a cultural argument. The backlash did not creep in slowly. It erupted. The trailer quickly became one of the most heavily disliked pieces of promotional material Disney had released in recent memory. As I scrolled through comments and reactions, I noticed something important. This was not a single, unified complaint. It was a collision of expectations, frustrations, and long-standing anxieties about what Disney remakes now represent. For many viewers, the trailer felt less like an invitation back into a beloved fairy tale and more like a declaration that the story they grew up with was no longer the priority. What struck me most was how emotional the response felt. People were not simply saying they disliked the visuals or the tone. They were expressing a sense of loss. Snow White is not just another title in Disney's catalog. It is the foundation. The animated film, released in 1937, was not only Disney's first feature-length animation, it was a symbol of innocence, fantasy, and timeless storytelling. When a story carries that kind of weight, even small changes feel amplified, and this trailer did not feel small to many viewers. As I watched it again, trying to separate my own nostalgia from what was actually on screen, I began to understand why the reaction was so strong. The trailer did not clearly signal what kind of film it wanted to be. It borrowed visual cues from the classic version, while framing its heroine in a distinctly modern light. The tone felt uncertain, suspended somewhere between fairy tale romance and contemporary empowerment drama. Instead of reassuring audiences, that ambiguity unsettled them. People were not sure what they were being asked to emotionally invest in. The marketing, whether intentionally or not, also placed enormous attention on symbolism rather than story. Instead of highlighting the emotional journey, the music, or the sense of wonder, the conversation immediately shifted toward what had changed and why. Once that happens, a trailer stops being a piece of storytelling and becomes a referendum. I could feel the audience pulling apart every frame, not out of curiosity, but out of suspicion. That is a dangerous place for any film to start. What I find most compelling and troubling is that this reaction did not come from a fringe audience. It came from the core, families, longtime Disney fans, casual viewers, and online commentators all seemed to share the same initial confusion. They were not rejecting the idea of a new Snow White. They were reacting to the feeling that the emotional contract between Disney and its audience had quietly shifted. The trailer did not promise comfort or magic. It promised reinterpretation, and it did so without clearly explaining its purpose. From my perspective, this is where the firestorm truly ignited. The trailer was not offensive. It was uncertain, and uncertainty invites projection. Viewers filled in the gaps with their own fears about Disney's direction, about losing cultural touchstones, about being told that the stories they loved were somehow outdated. None of that needed to be stated explicitly. The trailer's tone allowed those anxieties to surface on their own. By the time the dust began to settle, the narrative around Snow White was already set. The film was no longer being judged on what it was, but on what people believed it represented. And once a trailer crosses that threshold, recovering trust becomes far more difficult. This was not just the launch of a movie. It was the spark that revealed how fragile the relationship between Disney and its audience has become. As the noise around the trailer settled into something more reflective, I found myself returning to the central figure of the controversy, Snow White herself. More specifically, the way this new version of the character feels unfamiliar, not because she is different in appearance or personality alone, but because the film seems uncertain about how much of the original identity it still wants to carry forward. Watching the trailer again with that question in mind, I began to see why so many viewers felt emotionally disconnected rather than simply surprised. I want to be precise here. This reaction is not about rejecting change for the sake of change. Fairy tales have always evolved, and reinterpretation is part of their survival. But Snow White is a uniquely delicate case. She is not only a character, she is a symbol shaped by decades of repetition in animation, illustration, merchandise, and collective memory. When I think of Snow White, I think of softness, vulnerability, and a quiet moral clarity that defines her strength without needing to announce it. That image is deeply ingrained, and any deviation from it carries consequences. In this version, Snow White is presented as more assertive, more grounded, and more openly self-directed. On paper, none of this is inherently problematic. In fact, it aligns closely with how modern heroines are often written. The issue arises in how the transformation is framed. Instead of feeling like a natural evolution of the character, it feels like a deliberate repositioning, as though the film is anxious to distance itself from the very qualities that once defined her. As a viewer, I do not feel guided through that transition. I feel confronted by it. The unfamiliarity deepens when the story alters the symbolic logic of the character herself. Snow White's name, historically tied to visual metaphor and poetic simplicity, now carries a different narrative explanation. This may seem like a minor adjustment, but in a fairy tale, symbols are the structure. They are not decoration. When those symbols are rewritten, the story subtly changes its language, and the audience has to relearn how to read it. Many viewers, myself included, were not given enough context to understand why this change was necessary or what it added emotionally. What troubles me most is not that Snow White is portrayed differently, but that the film appears to underestimate how much meaning audiences attach to familiarity. Familiarity does not mean stagnation. It means emotional grounding. Successful remakes understand this and treat the original as an anchor, not an obstacle. Here, the anchor feels loosened. The character seems caught between honoring the past and speaking to the present, without fully committing to either. This tension becomes especially visible when Snow White is placed alongside other characters in the trailer. Her presence feels modern, while the world around her still borrows heavily from the aesthetics of the animated classic. The result is a subtle mismatch. I do not feel like I am watching a character who naturally belongs in this world. I feel like I am watching a character who is being asked to redefine it, and not everyone is ready to follow. As a reviewer, I try to separate intention from impact. I can understand the intention behind creating a Snow White who resonates with contemporary values. I can respect the desire to offer young audiences a heroine who actively shapes her destiny. But impact is measured by reception, not aspiration. And the reception here suggests that many viewers felt disoriented rather than inspired. Ultimately, this unfamiliarity is the quiet core of the backlash. It is not anger, but estrangement. Audiences are not refusing to meet a new Snow White. They are struggling to recognize her as part of a story they thought they already knew. And when a remake loses that sense of recognition, it risks becoming something else entirely. Not a retelling, but a replacement. That distinction matters more than Disney may have anticipated. After the trailer had already set the stage for controversy, it was not the visuals or the story details that pushed the conversation further apart. It was language. More specifically, the words spoken in interviews, sound bites, and promotional appearances. As I followed those discussions, I realized that the divide surrounding Snow White did not widen because of what was shown on screen, but because of how the film was explained off-screen. In today's media landscape, that distinction matters more than ever. I approach this part of the conversation with care, because public statements are often clipped, reshaped, and circulated without their full context. Still, perception is reality when it comes to audience reception. When the lead actress spoke about the original animated film, many listeners did not hear curiosity or reinterpretation. They heard dismissal. Whether that was the intention or not almost became irrelevant. What mattered was how those words landed with an audience that already felt uncertain. From my perspective, the problem was not the idea of updating Snow White's motivations. It was the framing. The classic version was described as passive, outdated, or overly focused on romance, and the new version was positioned as a correction rather than a continuation. That choice of language created an unnecessary hierarchy, one where the past was subtly portrayed as something to be fixed. For fans who cherish the original, not as a political statement but as a childhood memory, that framing felt personal. What followed was predictable. The conversation stopped being about character development and became about respect. Audiences began asking a simple question. If the people making this film do not seem to value the original story, why should they trust them to retell it? That question lingered beneath nearly every reaction I read. It transformed skepticism into defensiveness, and defensiveness into rejection. I have seen this pattern before with other remakes, and the contrast is telling. When actors and filmmakers speak with visible affection for the source material, audiences are more forgiving of change. They feel invited into a shared exploration. Here, the tone felt different. It felt declarative rather than conversational. Instead of saying, "This is what we love and how we are building on it," the message many heard was, "This is what we are moving away from." The situation became even more delicate when comments about the romantic elements of the story surfaced. The original fairy tale romance was reframed in a way that many interpreted as reductive or dismissive. Again, this may not have been the intention, but language carries weight, especially when it touches on themes that have endured for generations. For some viewers, romance was never the problem. It was part of the emotional texture of the story. When that texture was spoken about as a flaw, it felt like a rejection of the audience's emotional experience. From a reviewer's standpoint, I find this deeply instructive. Films do not exist in isolation anymore. They exist within conversations. And those conversations are shaped as much by interviews as by trailers. In this case, the words meant to clarify the film's vision ended up reinforcing the fear that the remake was less interested in honoring its roots than in distancing itself from them. What troubles me most is that this divide was avoidable. A different tone, a more inclusive way of speaking about the past, could have reframed the entire discussion. Instead of deepening curiosity, the language deepened suspicion. Instead of building a bridge between generations, it drew a line. By the time the interviews faded from headlines, the damage had already been done. The film was no longer just being evaluated as a creative work. It was being judged as a statement. And once a movie becomes a symbol in a cultural argument, it becomes much harder for audiences to simply sit back, relax, and let the story speak for itself. If the reinterpretation of Snow White unsettled audiences, the handling of the Seven Dwarfs pushed that unease into open confusion. As I watched the discussion unfold, this aspect of the film felt less like a creative choice and more like a crossroads where intention, symbolism, and execution collided. The Seven Dwarfs are not a footnote in this story. They are foundational. Their presence defines the rhythm, tone, and emotional warmth of the original fairy tale. Changing them was always going to be risky, but the way this film approached that change made the risk feel amplified rather than thoughtful. From the earliest reports, it became clear that Disney was struggling to reconcile modern sensibilities with a story rooted in an older fantasy framework. The public debate around representation added pressure to an already delicate element of the film. Instead of clarifying their direction early, the studio appeared to hesitate, and that hesitation became visible in the final result. As a viewer, I did not sense confidence. I sensed uncertainty. And uncertainty is rarely comforting when audiences are being asked to accept something new. The decision to reimagine the Seven Dwarfs as fully computer-generated mythical beings was framed as a way to avoid reinforcing outdated tropes. On the surface, that explanation sounds careful and considerate. But when I actually look at what appears on screen, the logic begins to unravel. These characters are still miners living together in the forest, still fulfilling nearly the same narrative function as before. The difference is not conceptual, it is aesthetic. And that difference introduces a strange contradiction. What I find most troubling is the missed opportunity hidden inside this choice. By removing the chance for real performers to inhabit these roles, the film avoids one kind of criticism while inviting another. It raises questions about inclusion rather than resolving them. Many viewers asked a simple, reasonable question. Why modernize one aspect of the story while digitally recreating another that closely resembles its animated predecessor. The film seems to want progress without confrontation, and that middle ground satisfies no one. Visually, the issue becomes even more pronounced. The computer-generated characters exist in a space that feels slightly out of sync with the human performers. Their movements lack the physical individuality that once gave each dwarf a distinct personality. In the animated classic, their bodies, gestures, and rhythms told stories of their own. Here, they feel uniform, carefully designed, but emotionally distant. As I watched them interact with Snow White, I felt a subtle but persistent sense of disconnection, as though two different films were sharing the same frame. This visual disconnect feeds directly into the emotional one. The Seven Dwarfs were never just comic relief. They were the heart of the original film, providing warmth, safety, and companionship. By rendering them in a style that feels cautious and sanitized, the film risks hollowing out that emotional core. The characters are present, but their humanity feels muted, even though they are not meant to be human in the traditional sense. From a reviewer's perspective, this dilemma reflects a larger issue with the remake as a whole. The film appears deeply concerned with how it will be perceived, yet that concern prevents it from making bold, coherent choices. Instead of redefining the Seven Dwarfs with clarity and conviction, it places them in a conceptual gray zone. They are neither fully reimagined nor fully honored. They exist as a compromise, and compromises rarely inspire affection. I do not believe this choice came from malice or indifference. It feels like the result of trying to navigate an increasingly complex cultural landscape without a clear narrative compass. But intention does not erase impact. For many viewers, this decision became a symbol of the film's larger identity crisis. A story that once felt intimate and human now feels filtered through layers of caution. In the end, the Seven Dwarfs dilemma is not just about these characters. It is about trust. Trust that the filmmakers understand why these figures mattered in the first place, and trust that change is being driven by storytelling rather than fear. Right now, that trust feels fragile, and the film has yet to show whether it can earn it back. After following every stage of this conversation, from the trailer's release to the debates surrounding its characters and messaging, I find myself returning to one unavoidable question. Who is this movie really for? It is a question that does not come from hostility, but from genuine confusion. As a viewer, I try to place myself in the position of the audience Disney seems to be addressing, and the answer never feels entirely clear. On one hand, the film appears to reach out to longtime fans by preserving recognizable imagery, musical cues, and narrative landmarks from the original story. These elements are familiar, almost reassuring, as if to say that the heart of Snow White is still intact. On the other hand, the film simultaneously pushes against that familiarity, reframing characters, themes, and motivations to align with contemporary values. Neither approach is wrong in isolation. The tension arises when both are pursued at the same time without a clear hierarchy. As I watch the trailer and absorb the surrounding discourse, I sense a film that is trying to speak to multiple audiences at once. It wants to comfort viewers who grew up with the animated classic, while also signaling progressiveness to a younger, more socially conscious generation. In theory, that balance is possible. In practice, it requires extraordinary narrative discipline. Here, the balance feels strained. Instead of harmonizing different expectations, the film seems to oscillate between them. This creates a peculiar outcome. Traditional audiences feel that the story they loved is being subtly sidelined. Meanwhile, more modern viewers question whether the changes go far enough or are executed with sufficient coherence. The result is not a bridge, but a gap. I do not see one audience fully embracing the film. I see several audiences standing at a distance, each unsure whether this story is truly speaking to them. What complicates matters further is the age range the film appears to target. Snow White has always been a story accessible to children, yet emotionally rich enough for adults. In this remake, the visual design and thematic ambition seem more mature, while certain aesthetic choices remain overtly childlike. As a viewer, I struggle to imagine how younger audiences will respond to characters that feel visually unsettling or emotionally distant. At the same time, adult viewers are being asked to engage with a story that avoids fully committing to dramatic complexity. From a reviewer's standpoint, this is where the film's identity crisis becomes most visible. Successful remakes know exactly who they are speaking to. They make deliberate choices and accept the audiences they may lose along the way. This film appears unwilling to make that sacrifice. It wants universal appeal, but universal appeal cannot be manufactured through compromise alone. It emerges from confidence, from a clear understanding of what the story is and why it matters now. I do not believe this project exists purely for profit, nor do I believe it is driven solely by ideology. It feels like a film caught between corporate legacy and cultural transition. Disney is trying to preserve its icons while redefining its values, and Snow White has become a testing ground for that effort. Unfortunately, when a film carries that burden, the story itself often becomes secondary. As I reflect on everything I have seen and heard so far, I am left with a quiet sense of melancholy rather than anger. Snow White deserved clarity. It deserved a vision strong enough to carry change without apology and tradition without defensiveness. Instead, it feels like a film that is constantly negotiating with itself. Perhaps the final answer to who this movie is for has not yet fully emerged. It may only become clear once audiences sit in theaters and experience the story without the noise that surrounds it. But based on what has been presented so far, Snow White does not feel like it belongs wholly to anyone. And for a fairy tale built on emotional connection and timeless simplicity, that may be its most troubling transformation of all.